Welcome to Busted Speakers, I'm Ed.
I'm Alex.
And I'm Cam.
And today we're going to be reviewing the debut solo album by Hayley Williams. Now, in terms of bands and artists that have really come into their own over the years, Paramore are certainly one of the first groups that spring to mind, with Hayley Williams, of course, being the leader of that group. Paramore really proved their worth, I think, on their self-titled album, even though I do like a lot of their material before that record, where they really just ventured into a whole lot of different genre experiments, including like a post-rock song and some funky jams like Ain't It Fun, which is one of my favourite pop songs of the last decade for sure. And then they did After Laughter, which was basically a straight-up new wave album. It definitely had a lot of elements of Paramore's music, what people knew them for, but it was very much a new wave alternative dance album up front. One thing that has tied all of those records together is, I'd say, the personal lyrics of Hayley Williams and also her personality coming through on the mic. And she has, amazing stage presence as well from what I've seen. So it was really only a matter of time before she would come out and do her own solo thing. There are still members of Paramore involved in this new project called Petals for Armor, but it's definitely a different beast from what we've heard from Paramore. So yeah, what did you think of this record, Cam?
I was really looking forward to this one. I was hyped through the roof as soon as it was announced. I was never a hardcore fan of Paramore in the early days, but, I always liked them because, I was, like, the only person in my school who liked the Fall Out Boys and Panic at the Discos of the time, so Paramore was just, like, another band I could latch on to. And, I kept up with them, picked up the self-titled and After Laughter pretty close to when they were released, but I actually didn't get too much into them until the last couple of years here. The self-titled has become one of my probably top 10 favorite albums, period. With that, and then After Laughter getting even more, I think, acclaim, or at least more general listener praise and, more chart success, and the lyrics going to some much darker places on that album. I was looking forward to see, what Hayley would do to branch off from that on her solo work, and especially with the release of the lead single, Simmer, and its very overt influence from, of all things, Radiohead's King of Limbs, the last thing I would have expected anyone to take influence from in terms of Radiohead. I wanted to hear what else she could come up with, what other things she would be taking influence from. And so after hearing the whole album, hearing all of the various influences that she's taken, and even writing some songs that continue on from the sound of After Laughter, and the subject matter that she goes into is even more personal and a little bit not harder to sit through, just a little bit more uncomfortable, I guess, because of just how personal it is. I can say that this was absolutely worth the wait that it's taken for her to release a solo record, and it stands with some of Paramore's best work.
And Alex, what did you make of this one?
I really enjoyed it. I think it's a very consistent album. I think it's actually one of the most consistent of the year. I don't think it really falls off in quality at any point. Pretty much exactly what I wanted from her, this album. This is her and Taylor, right, from Paramore?
Yeah, I believe Taylor York handled a lot of the production or co-produced it with Hayley, and the bassist who was on After Laughter and a great deal of the self-titled is also present here on the bass.
Yeah, so even though you could say this has the entire Paramore lineup that was what Paramore was at certain points of 2016 before Zach rejoined, this does feel like a full solo album from Hayley Williams. Definitely feels really personal, like Cam was saying. I'm not sure I could call it a spiritual successor to After Laughter, but it definitely continues a lot of great things from there. All of the songs have really, really good intricate hooks to them. There could be different parts of songs I'm remembering differently from each other within the same song. That's how catchy and well written a lot of these songs are. Basically, I'm just really happy with it. The rollout for this album, we'll get into that soon, wasn't the best. I kind of fell off after the first two singles. I didn't keep up with all of the stuff she was releasing before this album came out. Even though I like all the songs here and I would have enjoyed them at the time, the rollout kind of unexcited me to it, if that's a word.
Yeah, the rollout is definitely a bit of a point of contention for a lot of people, and I completely understand why. And personally, I'm really glad that I didn't listen to the bulk of the second EP and just waited for the entire thing to come out after the first 5 tracks dropped, because it probably would have ruined a lot of the just initial impact of hearing this album front to back for me. Just for context, for people who don't know, the album was released essentially as 3 separate mini EPs, and that's a weird trend that seems to have been happening a fair bit recently. I remember Denzel Curry doing it with his Taboo album being released in 3 separate parts, and then Kevin Abstract did it later.
Yeah, and I think Foster the People did it back in 2017. It's something I've noticed as well.
Yeah, and out of all of those cases, I'd say Hayley has the best case for releasing her music this way, because the album does feel intentionally sequenced as 3 separate sections as opposed to one fully cohesive thing front to back, even though there's a lot of the same themes and ideas running through the entire thing. It does feel like 3 distinct sets of tracks.
Now, it's interesting you say that, because even though I definitely agree there's a distinct difference between the first 10 and the last 5, I didn't quite make the distinction between the first 5 and second 5. Like, that seemed like a pretty seamless 10 tracks to me. Maybe you could explain to me the distinction. Is it just that they were 2 different EPs that they feel separate, or is there something more there?
Perhaps it's maybe a subconscious thing, honestly. I mean, on Spotify, the full album is actually listed as 3 separate discs. So
so it is more than just the.
It's more than just
putting
the
them
rollout.
in 3 quadrants. It is consciously made to feel like different parts.
I think perhaps it is. That's certainly the impression I got. I just feel like the second part of the album is a lot more poppy and brings back a lot of those ideas from After Laughter, like Cam mentioned. I think it goes a lot more into the new wave influences in that part of the album. And
second part, not the third one.
The second part, yeah. Whereas the first part, I'd say, is a lot more Radiohead influenced and a lot more moody. But yeah, to get into my general thoughts on the album, I was also really excited for this one, and even though the rollout sort of dampened my expectations a little, my concern was pretty much unfounded, because this is a really solid debut from Hayley as a solo artist. I feel like she's one of few artists who are popular and mainstream today that has a lot of unique inflections, and compared to Paramore's stuff, this really goes all out in that regard. There's a lot of hooks that are fully constructed around Hayley's voice and have maybe multiple layers of vocals happening in one section. There's one song, Cinnamon, that has its main groove built around this one weird vocal sample of Hayley that pans across from one ear to the other and sounds really, really strange on headphones, but really satisfying to hear. I know not everyone's a fan of that moment, but I digress. The album as a whole, though, honestly, really solid. I do have some problems with the sequencing, even though I do find the album to be very cohesive. And there's certainly moments here where she's in danger of feeling like she's drowning in her influences a bit too much, but I honestly think the way she implements those influences is really, really good. She very clearly wears those influences on her sleeve, but it's very rarely to the record's detriment. Cam mentioned Radiohead's The King of Limbs, and there's definitely some of that in here. But in particular, I think there's a lot of clear and very welcome influence from Radiohead's last album, A Moon-Shaped Pool, and patches of Radiohead's earlier work crop up as well. But with those particular influences, the songs are never at risk of feeling like Hayley's not at the wheel. There's maybe a few moments here that we'll get into when we go track by track that are in danger of sounding derivative, but just about managed to introduce enough new ideas and personality to keep that from happening. I think the best thing about this album, honestly, just to summarize my thoughts, is it has a real sense of agency that I don't hear on Paramore's material quite as much. It's a vibe that's definitely at the forefront of this album. I think she was very consciously trying to give the music this feeling to distinguish it more from Paramore's material. She manages to very successfully siphon her thoughts, feelings, and perspective in a way that makes so much sense for a solo album by an artist who's sort of forever been associated with the band that she came up in. That's not counting her features on B.O.B.'s Aeroplanes or, but we don't talk about that. We don't talk about that or the Zed song.
I was wondering if you were going to mention that, because those are technically the first instances of her outside of Paramore, but yeah, we don't need to mention those any further.
I guess you're right, but yeah, in terms of her main catalogue of albums, this is definitely the first time I've got this real sense of agency from her. And yeah, overall, I dug it a fair bit. So yeah, if we go track by track, the opening song, Simmer, was also the first single, the first taste of this album, and man, when this song dropped, I think that was possibly the first moment in music in 2020 where I thought to myself, here's something to be really excited about, honestly.
Yeah.
What did you guys think of Simmer?
This might sound pathetic, but when I first heard it, I was like most excited about the fact that I could kind of pick up on the King of Limbs influence before anyone else had really, like, before I saw anyone else really talk about it. That's hopelessly pathetic and nerdy of me, but it's just like, oh, cool, somebody actually, enjoyed that album enough to, take something from it. And, like, it was confirmed, when she made the playlist of songs that influenced the album, and there was a track from King of Limbs sitting right on it.
Wow.
There's that, and then, of course, once I, stopped patting myself on the back over nothing, I started getting into the song itself, the lyrics and the subject matter, and just, like, how she used her, vocal performance and the music to communicate the message of it. And I'm like, okay, if this is the kind of depth that we can expect from the whole album, this thing is going to be amazing.
Yeah, this is still a knockout track. I mean, when this dropped, I'm pretty sure all Paramore fans and even just music fans in general just got really excited at the prospect of a solo album from her. So what was it about it specifically that reminded you of King of Limbs, Cam? Was it the like bass line and guitar lines, or was it like the breathy vocal noises that were going on throughout? Or
yeah, I mean, it was a combination of everything really, but especially the breathy vocal noises. It like mostly remind me of what was the song with the weird dance, Lotus, White Lotus or whatever.
Lotus Flower.
Lotus Flower, yeah, that's it. Which, coincidentally
Yeah, Petals for Armor. It's a recurring theme, flowers for growth on this album.
Yep.
There you go.
Oh yeah, we'll get into that.
Yeah.
All right, that's the entire album solved. We can pack it in, boys. Let's go home.
Yep. That's it done in a bite-sized version there.
All right, thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Yep. This is a great song about, I feel like, containing your inner rage,
Mm-hmm.
It's like a therapeutic self-dialogue about our own experiences with this, and scenarios exploring it. The line, if my child needed protecting from a fucker like that man, I'd sooner gut him. That line is still a cutting line, and damn, still can't believe that one. That is like one of the best lines I think she's ever put out ever, if that's fair to say.
100% agree. And it's another one of those cases where it's not just lyrically where it's really biting. The way she delivers it is so perfect. It's spot on.
I love how in the first verse the like way she transitions to the next line is like her breathing noise again. Like that is inspired. Little moments like that are what make songs like this really great.
Yeah, I think the way a lot of the little vocal chops and expressions that aren't even necessarily doing anything lyrically, they really established that sense of agency right off the bat, where Hayley herself is essentially being used as an instrument for part of the music.
Yeah.
The breathing sounds at the beginning are almost uncomfortably up front, and it gives her this command of the
Those
song,
are almost definitely purposely done to be that way, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, great song. I honestly can't imagine anyone other than Hayley pulling a song like this off, even though it does have that big Radiohead influence. On the whole, it's probably my favourite song on the album, honestly, which I suppose is a little disappointing in a sense, but there are other tracks that come close, don't get me wrong, and this is a very consistent album overall. All in all, great track. The only part I'm not really huge on is the bridge that comes in about 3/4 of the way through, with its vocal embellishments feeling a little scattered and hazy in a way that I find a little distracting. When the rest of the song feels so locked into that menacing groove, I sort of get what she was going for with having a section that feels more scattered.
But that's where the album title originates, the Wrap Yourself in Petals bit.
For sure, so it feels integral, and it certainly succeeds in giving the final chorus more impact when it bursts back in, which is probably my favourite moment of the song, but strictly on its own merit, it's the part of Simmer that I enjoy considerably less than the rest of it. But all in all, hell of a first single and a hell of an opener. Moving on from there, we have track 2, which is called Leave It Alone. This is probably the track where the Radiohead influence comes through strongest for me, and it's not to its detriment in the slightest. The string embellishments on this track are freaking gorgeous, man. And that goes for the rest of the album whenever they crop up too. There's a bunch of tracks with great strings on here. But yeah, another great track.
The song hurts to hear, man. You know, it's probably quite suitable to have a quieter, more low-key, slower track after Simmer, which was a complete knockout song. But this one's quite a bare arrangement. Even though the first track and most of this album does have her voice pretty up front, this one I feel like focuses mainly on her voice as the main focal point, with percussion and bass coming in. So another really excellent song. I'd say almost as good as Simmer, but it's a completely different animal. You know, the refrain of the chorus, the truth's a killer, but I can't leave it alone. It's like they know something's bad for them, but they can't help it, and that's an illness. It's just another song of hurt, and it does hurt to hear, but I think she's made something really great out of it. I think this is a really excellent song. Maybe it doesn't impact as hardly as Simmer does, but I think it's more of a slow burner that creeps in and nestles itself in your psyche, and it just ends up being one of the strongest songs on the album as well.
Well, that's what I feel largely about the first part of the album, if you want to call it that. It does sort of slowly creep up on you in a way, aside from Simmer being this huge, flashy opener that's very direct with its emotions.
I'd say it creeping up on you.
You just couldn't resist it, could you? But leave it alone, yeah, lyrically, it's probably the heaviest track here, maybe.
I'd say so.
It feels a lot more personal and raw than anything we've really heard from Hayley before this, but it helps that musically it's really good as well. It's really lovely the way the song's constructed in contrast to sort of how depressive the lyrical themes are. Moving on to track 3, we have Cinnamon, which was that song also released as a single, or does it just have a music video?
I think it was the last single before the EP was officially announced.
Just a little personal story. I was convinced the main vocal refrain, that bit, you know, the bit that Ed was talking about earlier, that is like the crutch of the song, sounded so familiar, and I was convinced it was from a Radiohead song. And I'm not just saying that because a lot of this album is influenced a bit by them, but I think it may have actually been this very song I was reminded of. I'm pretty sure I listened to it back in the day, 3 months ago or whenever it dropped, which feels a lot longer ago than it probably should be due to current events, which you all should be aware of. But yeah, that hook, that proves how just of an earworm that hook is. The fact that I was so reminded of it when I maybe only heard it once back in the day. It's extremely catchy, maybe the biggest hook of the album.
Yeah, it's a super groovy track as well. I love the way it's built around that vocal sample. It's definitely another favourite for me, which continues the real winning streak of the first few tracks of this album.
Oh yeah, at this point I'd say the first 3 tracks are almost equally as good in my mind.
To my mind, the highlights are kind of at the beginning of the album, but it doesn't necessarily feel front-loaded. It more just sort of settles out into a general level of quality after that. There's a few tracks that I'd probably take off this thing because they really don't do much other than reiterate ideas that you've already heard, or there's some songs later on that I felt a bit underdeveloped. But yeah, that infectious panning vocal sample of Hayley driving the song forward through the intro and the choruses, it's great. It's another song that feels really spiritually indebted to Radiohead in places, although there's a much funkier groove here than you'd ever hear on a Radiohead track. It's more just Hayley's vocal delivery that reminds me of Tom York a little bit on this song.
I don't know if you guys would agree, but unintentionally, and she had no way of knowing this because this song was released a lot earlier than what I'm about to mention, but this song actually reminds me a lot of the elements of some of the recent Fiona Apple album.
Yeah, I can.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I can hear that.
Yeah. Very ad hoc, sort of ramshackle drumming. Maybe it's only purposely because she describes her day-to-day life in the lyrics, daily lifestyle alone, but I don't think it's meant to be done in a sad way because she resolves it at the end with the incredibly catchy hook. This is what I'm talking about. This song ends with the "I'm not lonely baby, I am free" bit, which is in it of its own right an exceptionally catchy part, but it also has the main vocal refrain I talked about earlier. These songs have so many little different parts that are so catchy that they're just overloaded with really accessible hooks that are really, really good.
Yeah, the way the hooks come together at the end, it did remind me a little bit of the song Fake Happy from After Laughter, because it kind of develops into this like situation where they're kind of just riding out the track with the refrains that have already been established, just looping over and over and just playing out that groove. It was a cool thing to bring back. Not to say that Paramore came up with that structure. They most certainly didn't. but it just reminded me of that moment, given that it's, also Hayley's music. It's funny you mentioned Fiona Apple's newest album, because the kind of rustic, homespun vibe of that album is something that I hear in a different way on this, with the more earthy tones that they're going for. I don't know if you guys felt that way, but I feel like the drum sounds on here they're not really rock influenced a lot of the time. It feels like homemade samples in a way. Hayley's come out and said the album's going for a more sort of earthy vibe in general, and I think that comes through in the instrumentation a lot of the time.
Yep. So what do you think of Creepin, Cam, the next song?
Yeah, Creepin and Sudden Desire were both the ones that took me the longest to wrap my head around. Like, their function on the album, and especially like the flow of the album overall, but also just like the EP. Because like you start with something heavier, like the first two tracks. Simmer is like very dense to match its subject matter. Leave It Alone has the
it's more lyrically heavy.
Yeah, it's more lyrically heavy, and it's more sparse to emphasize the weight of those feelings and everything. And then the next two, or whatever, the last two on the EP are just like odd in their own ways. Like especially Creepin, just talking about like an energy vampire baby.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, you're not trying to call back to the song from Twilight, are you? Like there's no way to not make that connection for at least half a second.
I did not think of that. I did not make that connection, but that's pretty funny.
It did actually cross my mind, but I just had to force myself to think, no, that's not the frame of reference here.
It's probably good that I don't naturally come to that conclusion. That's not been a ruined association for me.
Yeah, it hasn't hurt it for me. It was just something that crossed my mind. Yeah,
so it's like once I kept listening to the album and got to some of the lyrics later on, then Creepin started to make a little more sense. But I don't know, it just like it goes to a bit of a darker sound that I don't think the rest of the album really revisits much. I do think that there's a purpose for that. Like it does feel like there is some kind of general flow to the whole album, from like darker earlier tracks to trying to pull herself out of a darker state of mind in the middle and the end. In that way, this song fits, like I understand it now.
Yeah, having said that, it is definitely one of the weaker tracks here. I think out of the first 5, the last 2 are definitely the weakest of this stretch of the track list. The hook is fine, if a tad underdeveloped, and I don't think this song grows and builds an atmosphere nearly as well as the first 3 tracks, even though it's consciously, on the surface, it seems like it should be a lot darker. I don't really feel it anywhere near as much as I do with songs like Simmer and Leave It Alone. That being said, I still kinda like this song, even though it's certainly the weakest moment of the first part of the track list, as I said. It's still pretty good.
Yeah, it's still pretty good. I wouldn't say it's a great song, and even though I've said the whole album's really consistent, this is definitely a bit of a drop from the first 3 songs. It doesn't do much to establish the verse before it suddenly goes into the chorus. Why you creeping round here? I don't even think that's meant to be the main hook. I think the best part of this is it always starts with something so simple and innocent bit. That's what I'm saying, like, that's a really excellent melodic part.
That's the part of the song I remember most, even though it's only used once, right? It's more of a bridge. I think
it gets overlaid with the creeping bit towards the fade out as well. The vampire analogies, keep sucking on the memory of him, and like a vampire sneaks around. I don't really know what to make of that. I guess it makes it a bit darker. It's more of a sensual song. That's the main thing to note, I think, of this one, and that leads into Sudden Desire pretty well, I guess.
After spending like probably way too much time thinking about it, I feel like the vampire in this case is like regret, or could be depression or something. Just that if you want to get that simple about it.
Yeah, that's like creeping round her emotional well-being.
Yeah.
Okay, I was thinking of it way too literally, like she was talking to someone specifically, which she could still be in a way.
It's definitely an outlier in the track list in that regard. I'd say every other track here, it's quite clear what feeling she's trying to get across.
Which is felt explicitly on the next song, Sudden Desire, which I think was a big but positive surprise, maybe the biggest of the track list. I guess this would end the EP on a kind of positive note, but also a kind of confused note. I might have this completely wrong the way I've looked into this song, but I didn't expect it to suddenly become a adrenaline of like sexual excitement that this song is, and I think this has the most upbeat, full-on pop chorus of the album at this point.
It's definitely the most upfront and in
yeah,
your
that's what I'm
face,
saying. Like, I didn't expect
excluding Simmer maybe.
the sort of like full-throated, yelled-out choruses to suddenly flashback to sort of like yelled choruses of Paramore. I didn't expect that, and it's a really positive song. Going back in time, discovering her feelings of why she got with that man in the first place, like the sudden desire, the excitement of feelings. That's kind of what I got from this song, but also sort of confusion around it as well.
Yeah, I didn't take this as a positive song, honestly, but, you know, take it how you want. But I saw it as more of a, she's aware of these feelings and she kind of is confused and anxious around them, around still having physical feelings for an ex-lover. It's really put across just more in the tone of the instrumental that it's not necessarily a celebration of those feelings. It's kind of about how the feeling of desire can be a bad thing.
That's what I was saying. It's kind of a confused song in the end. Like, no matter what I got from it, I wasn't entirely sure how to feel about it, even though I really like the song.
Yeah, on the whole, it's another really solid tune. I like this one more than Creepin. Not quite as much as the first 3 tracks, though. Structurally, there's a lot to like about this one, though, with it kind of taking its time to build up to that chorus, teasing you with a little pre-chorus or bridge earlier on before it just explodes into the main chorus. There's a real sense of urgency to the refrains on here, with those buzzing low angular synth melodies building up menacingly in the chorus, and Hayley's backing vocal interjections adding a lot of nervous energy, which contrasts really well with the slow burning and minimal instrumentation of the verses.
It's probably a good musical idea that the chorus suddenly comes out of nowhere, like how the feelings would as well.
Well, yeah, like I said, the way those backing vocals are layered over it is kind of playing into that as well.
Now that I think about it, it's like almost like a sudden rush of dread almost it could be as well.
Yeah. That's the impression I got. Like, that's when the feelings are just rushing through, and the slow burn before that is kind of just mulling over.
I think about it that way, it probably is not a positive song in any way.
This song is all about, feeling desire for somebody, but it sounds like the song that might be written by a woman who's just about to have her, mind taken over by Dracula or something.
Definitely feels like quite a turbulent feeling to it.
Yeah, so I was reading into it, and I'm the one who does this all the time because I can't help it. I have no ability to form opinions of my own, and I need to know what the person who made the thing had to say about it. So I went on Genius, and I saw that the song is about realizing that, you have feelings for somebody new when you're still dealing with the pain of the last person who burned you.
Right, that explains the confusion of it all. Conflicted feelings.
I settled on it being a great song, and it takes its dichotomy and runs with it.
Yeah, so that concludes the first set of tracks. I think when we go into track 6, Dead Horse, this is a track that really kind of wallops you in the face with a stylistic shift.
Yeah.
It's a lot closer to the pop material that we were hearing on After Laughter, but still very much with its own vibe. Yeah, Dead Horse is not one of my favorites on the album on the whole, but it does get props from me for fully going in on the pop influences that have been undeniably present on Hayley's music for years, and some people haven't responded well to that. I've seen a lot of people say this is the weakest song here, which I couldn't disagree more with. It's a solid track. As with the rest of the album, the sound design is handled really tastefully, even though this is a very upfront pop song. It's a simple tune at its core, but lyrically it's got that edge that you'd expect from the tracks you've heard so far, and it really shines thanks to the performances and the production. The chorus is actually one of my favorites on here. I've come back to this track time and time again in isolation from the other songs just to hear that chorus, really. There's an interesting tongue-in-cheek quality to the ya 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 post-chorus that took a bit of time to grow on me, but I actually dig it now. It feels like it has a slight aura of spitefulness to it that I thought was kind of cool, even though on the surface initially you might think this is a little bit of an obnoxious moment.
Yeah, I almost thought it was a bit of a monotonous hook to begin with, but it definitely grew on me as well.
It feels like it's trying to give off that vibe, but it's still enjoyable to hear. Like it's trying to be intentionally monotonous in a way, but it manages to get away with it with the great performances and production and just structuring of these songs.
This one is a contender for the top 3 in my book. Maybe
nice.
Maybe in the top 5. Like, to me, this is like the first. Oh, okay, yeah, we're getting personal on this thing, especially in the second verse when it like goes full bore into Hayley's marriage and the reason for its ending, and like reading into it, learning that that's how it began, for that matter. Like I don't know, like we always say we don't want to get too much into this kind of thing, but I can't help it.
I mean, it's there on the album to be analyzed, so it's what the artist is putting across. It's fair to comment on.
Yeah, it's like this just feels like the most it feels like the most voyeuristic just because of the subject matter.
I get that impression from the music video as well,
yeah.
Which I believe Zach Farrow directed, actually, and it feels kind of like a quintessential 80s pop video, but with a little bit of a dark twist to it, of it emphasizing Hayley's image and her performance so much and never really cutting away from that, but also presenting it in kind of a raw way that matches the tone of the song.
Yeah, and then when I was doing all this reading into it, like I had mentioned in the text chat, that I finally understand like what some of the meaning of the album artwork is. Have you guys figured that out?
Yeah, I read that it was derived from a tattoo that she actually had. She had a tattoo of one of her ex-partner's names and had to tattoo a black square over it, essentially. So she took that concept further with the album art here of having all of these blotched over black tattooed squares following across her face, weirdly in the shape of a P. I don't know if that was intentional.
I thought it was a question mark.
Yeah, I thought it was a question mark too.
I don't know if it was a question mark or a P. You guys are probably 100% right there, but for some reason I saw it as a P. Maybe another subconscious thing.
I did not have that figured out, Cam. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm like, So like, okay, that's really the element that snapped the whole album into place for me.
That's cool. Do you want to take us into the next track, Alex?
My Friend.
Yeah.
I feel like songs like this that are a direct dialogue to another person, they're obviously going to feel naturally personal, as you'd expect from a song called My Friend. This is not one of the most notable songs on the album, but it's definitely a nice one. I have to give credit. I don't know who the drummer is here if it's not Zach Farrow, to be honest, but tight drumming and percussion on this one. And did you guys feel like the drum beats in the second half and the Who Could Take Your Place part felt like weird dated 80s synth fins, almost like could be from 80s hip-hop or something like that? It's like a weird sound to them.
I won't lie, My Friend's like one of the songs that I definitely enjoyed but found to be less memorable, so I can't really imagine it in my head what it sounds like currently, the part that you referenced.
It refers back to you like homespun DIY sounds to some of the drums anyway.
Yeah, and that's definitely not in the same way as we said it was with Fiona Apple, but again, they're not super traditional sounding drums either. They're mixed in such a way, or maybe certain samples were used to give it that down-to-earth vibe.
There's a nice just melodic sensibility to this song that's pretty nice. It's not one of my favourites, but nice personal song.
Yeah, it's a song that is slightly mellow in its mood, but it's definitely a nice track conceptually. Really, it's just an ode to friendship and finding comfort in the fact that you have that support system of friends when relationships go awry and whatnot.
Yeah.
And, the chorus is pretty sweet. She sounds kind of forlorn, I guess you would say, but also happy to have, friendship to celebrate. On the whole, it's musically one of the less interesting tracks, I'd say. I don't really have a whole lot to say about it other than that.
Yeah, I thought it was odd that this is like celebrating a solid friendship. I would expect the song to be a little bit more exuberant. This kind of feels like not quite mournful.
It's so mellow. It's so mellow considering the subject matter.
Yeah.
Next track is Over Yet, which I guess the closest to a sort of rock heavier type song just from the bass part, I guess. Even though it's a distinctly different animal from Paramore stuff, this bass part, and some nice melodic guitar parts too, definitely give this a sort of harder edge to some of the other songs.
Oh, for sure. And it's also the most outwardly synth pop and dance inspired track out of all the singles up until that point. It feels like the one that most directly follows up on the musical ideas of After Laughter, I'd say. Not that it would necessarily fit on that album, but it definitely takes the new wave influence a lot
I'd
further.
agree. Of what was offered up at that point, which would be the first EP, and this song that is the most referential to After Laughter of those 6 songs.
It's a cool little motivational song, essentially, that really hammers home the arduousness of picking yourself up and, you know, really doing something with your life, and acknowledges that that is an extremely difficult thing to do, but it ain't over yet, as she says. But it's a really groovy and fun track. The chorus is pretty catchy. Maybe not as catchy as something like Dead Horse, but it's also not as saccharine as that track. It's not as zoned into the pleasure principle, I suppose, with that song having a similar approach to something like Hard Times off After Laughter, where it's a very bright and chirpy song, but it's about a dark subject matter. I've always loved that in pop songs. I think I've mentioned that on the channel before. And there's definitely a few tracks on here that do it as well, even though for the most part this is not really a pop album, I wouldn't say. But when it does have pop moments like this, like Over Yet, they really manage to fit in on the album despite the vibes being maybe a bit more mellow, a bit more experimental, a bit more art rock.
Yeah, I was going to say art rock might be the closest to a one genre fin for this whole album, but even though it's a really consistent, uniform release, is there any one genre we can give it for the whole thing? Because it does explore a lot of different musical ideas within these 15 songs.
I always have trouble with this label, but singer-songwriter is one that people throw around because that's, I guess, is Hayley's role. But yeah, I guess art rock or maybe art pop is probably the most accurate description.
But when you think of it, singer-songwriter just stems from back in the day. That was the only way they could do it, was with an acoustic guitar. Maybe that phrase, singer-songwriter, should become to mean more than just that.
It's another one of those things like the label of indie, where we don't really know what it means anymore. Like, is it describing a certain sound? Is it describing independency as an artist, like not being on a big label or not even being on a label at all? I think it's just lost its meaning. I don't really linger on genre labels too much because they always are kind of outwardly vague like that when you try really hard to apply them.
That's true as well.
Fact is, this is just a great mix of different styles and influences that works pretty damn well most of the time.
It's like, I find it funny you had said that you thought Dead Horse was the most saccharine of the songs that are reminiscent of After Laughter, because I kind of thought that this one, like, I mean, I wouldn't have said saccharine necessarily, but just like given the subject matter of Dead Horse, I wouldn't have necessarily called that like anything close to feel good, but like...
Oh no, for sure. It's more the tone of the instrumental on there. I found it to be, I guess sugary would have been a better word for it. I just think Over Yet is probably just as poppy, but it's a bit more reserved.
I'll definitely give you more reserved, but I also feel like I wouldn't have gotten sugary from Dead Horse just because it fits the After Laughter mold of, you know, the pop song barely covering up the, you know, heavier subject matter.
Yeah,
I'll get into this later, but that's actually kind of why I find After Laughter a little hard to listen to more than once a year. Like, and there's nothing wrong with Over Yet necessarily. Like, I'm not saying it's, you know, it's so much worse because it's not as meaningful. We could use a feel-good song at this point in the album, you know, a stab of encouragement. But at the same time, this could have improved the sequencing if it was, like, later in the album, but that also might make it feel a little too deliberate, and that could also have killed it in a different way. So it's a really weird balancing act, and I can't say Hayley did it badly at all, but something feels off, but I can't think of how to improve it. It's a really weird headspace for this album.
I think I have a similar complaint for the album as a whole. I mentioned earlier I do have some issues with the sequencing, and I kept saying that on our car seat headrest review, and trust me, it's nowhere near as bad as that.
No, not at all.
Like, this album has so much more cohesion to it, even though there is a good sense of variety. It's more just the flow of the track list. It doesn't feel like it has a sense of progression to it that albums like After Laughter did. Even though it's very cohesive in its premise of being a very personal album to Hayley, it's not really specifically about anything. It goes on into different subjects from song to song, and obviously that's not necessarily a bad thing. But the tropes that repeat across the album that the title is in reference to, all these themes of flowers and how that relates to Hayley's own relationship with her femininity and kind of wanting to reclaim that, it doesn't feel like this huge statement on that. It just feels like a set of songs that go into it more so. And that is still a good thing. But it just means if I'm comparing this album to something like After Laughter, the sequencing just doesn't blow me away anywhere near as much. It doesn't feel like it has much of an arc to it, really. And also, I think on that front, it's 15 tracks long. It's kind of lengthy, only about 50 minutes if I recall correctly, but I probably would have cut a few tracks and moved a few around here. I think Over Yet, yeah, perhaps it could have been later in the track list, and I don't know if it really leads into the next track all that well either, but it's still a good song in my opinion. So yeah, speaking of the next track, we have Roses, Lotus, Violet, Iris, and lyrically, some of my favourite moments on the album crop up on this track. It's one of my favourite tracks overall, a strong contender against Simmer for being my absolute standout. The chorus rides along those atmospheric heavy synths really nicely. In terms of instrumentation, it's probably the standout of the whole album for me. Maybe just as a song as a whole, I prefer Simmer, but yeah, this is a great one. It features Boy Genius on the backing vocals and the chorus. Boy Genius obviously being a supergroup comprised of Julian Baker, Lucy Dacus, and Phoebe Bridgers, 3 great singer-songwriters that you should definitely check out.
Yeah, I'd say this is definitely a contender for best song on the album for me as well. I think this might straight up just be, aside from Future on the Paramore album, one of the most advanced and complex songs she's been involved with, writing, compositionally speaking.
Definitely.
And one that rewards repeated / concentrated listening. Also, similarly to Simmer, just has a really great, breathy, eerie intro to it. Only lasts about 20 seconds, but just before it gets into the song properly, it's just a really mysterious, eerie sound to it. I really like it. Then you get into the chorus, which is really well done. I guess it's Boy Genius providing a lot of the backing vocals there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really really deep, a lot of depth there. I swear each time the chorus comes in, there's more power to it than the last time as well.
Oh yeah, the track has an excellent build-up and progression. The density of the instrumental really speaks to that because more and more is being added, more intensity, the strings start to swell up at the end, and it just sounds great.
It's just a great moment of clarity. Like, I saw that song title, I was thinking, what on earth is this even going to be? And, well, it was just perfectly realised, and this is probably the strongest song with the analogies to flowers in the verses.
Oh yeah, it brings those themes, those references home for sure. I think without that track I might not have even really picked up on those motifs across the album. I think this track definitely is kind of like a centerpiece in that regard.
Yeah, and that'll continue to play a factor, especially with the track Watch Me While I Bloom later, I guess. Could also be
that's true.
Another one. So yeah, this definitely could rival Simmer as my favourite. It is the longest song, but it doesn't feel like it, really. I mean, it's one where you don't mind it being so long just because it's so rich and lush. So from that absolute monster of a song, Roses, Lotus, Violet, Iris, we go into track 10, Why We Ever. This is a pretty interesting song that throws a curveball about 2 minutes of the way in. For the first 2 minutes, it's like just another song from Hayley, which still means pretty good. Funky bass lines, beat, definitely making it seemingly, deceptively, more of an upbeat sounding number, and nothing to suggest it goes anywhere else. Well, it does. About 2 minutes in, it just falls apart into a really sad sounding piano ballad sort of thing. Did you guys expect that? Like, what did you think when you first heard that?
I didn't expect it. That's honestly a big point in my notes, so I'm kind of annoyed that you brought it up. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. At first, the song has like more of a laid-back groove to it. It's definitely another moment that feels very Fleetwood Mac inspired. I mean, Hayley's made it no secret that they're one of her favourite groups. I think on the After Laughter tour, they covered Dreams as well as Everywhere. So, no secret that Hayley's a big fan. And why wouldn't you be a big fan of the Mac? Unless you're some kind of uptight dickhead.
Yep.
Jeez, tell us how you really feel.
Yeah, well, no, I'm just kidding. Anyway, in terms of its structure, it definitely does throw a curveball because I felt like it was just settling into that influence. It's one of the moments that does feel more in danger of Hayley drowning in her influences a little too much. I'm not huge on the chorus at the start in the first section, but honestly, overall, it is a surprisingly dynamic song in terms of its structure, more so than you'd expect from its opening moments, like 100% echoing Alex's sentiments there. About midway through, as he mentioned, it just goes into this intimate section that's just piano, vocals, and the faint sound of a metronome before the drums and bass come back in, and it salvages what could have been one of the weaker tracks and makes it into something more interesting and special.
Yeah.
At the point where the album's most in danger of drowning in that influence. It's a curveball for sure, but it does it very gracefully, the way the instrumental sort of falls apart. It's very cool.
Yeah, like the second of the beginning 2-minute chorus had fully ended, and you might think, oh, it's going to go into a bridge or a solo or something here. But no, it just ends and goes into this, which does make you think maybe it was two song ideas put together. Like, I don't know if this naturally developed as it stands now, but I don't know.
She managed to make it work for sure, if that was the case, yeah.
Yeah, once you know it's coming up, it's really well, like, fused together, and does feel like a really strong song, I'd say. And the way it ends with sort of a personal mantra of I just want to talk about it, sorry for freaking out, it becomes hypnotic by the end, and that concretely ends the second part of the EP 5-song quadrants. I think that is a very strong divide and end to the second part and goes into the third part really well.
Yeah, I'd say the third part is where the sequencing is kind of at its most troubled. The third part feels the least cohesive. It feels realistically like maybe it could have been a bunch of bonus tracks, mostly of as higher quality as the rest of the album, but they do feel weirdly separate from the first two parts. Like I said, I still feel like this album has 3 distinct parts to it, but I agree with Alex that maybe the first 10 are the most cohesive put together. I mean, we'll get into it, but there's a few tracks in the third part that just change up the sound completely, basically.
Yeah. Did you like how this one changed up, Cam?
Yeah, it's always a good trick to pull out, having that kind of, unexpected shift into a softer version of the parts of the song that came before. I feel like Why We Ever kind of makes a good 1-2 punch with Roses. Which I'm just going to call Roses because the whole title's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is.
I feel like this is like the turning point in the album, or maybe even like the whole second, not even quadrant, the whole, whatever, this second EP, I'm just going to call it that.
Yeah, I don't know why I introduced the word quadrants into things.
Yeah.
It's not even in fours.
Nope.
It's segments is the word.
Yeah. We're leaving
yes,
all that in.
That's good. So
yeah, fine.
Like, this one it really feels like the point where Hayley's finally, like, the character, the narrator, whatever you want to call it, is finally, like, learning how to get out of their own head and, just, like, start to understand how to, just have more healthy relationships with themselves and the people around them. It definitely has thematic value on the album, that's for sure.
Yeah. I think if it was just a song that ran through those first moments in the first sort of half of the track and just closed them out with much more similar ideas, it'd end up being one of my least favorites here. I really don't like the flow of the chorus on here. It's a moment where I find myself not too impressed by Hayley's delivery, but I'm just glad it has that second half to really bring me back in.
I do think the first half is maybe one of the more forgettable parts of the whole album.
I'd say so. I'd say it reiterates a lot of the sounds and ideas that we've already heard, especially on tracks like My Friend. Following up Why We Ever, there's the song Pure Love. This one definitely grew on me. Initially, I really wasn't into it. I found it to be a little bit janky. There's a lot of grooves on this album that work really well, so it was kind of noticeable to me when this one just felt a little bit stuttery in its chorus especially. But really the main issue I have with this track is that it's almost the same one I had with the previous song, in that it feels totally indebted to Fleetwood Mac, and this is maybe the only track on the album where I feel like she does drown in those influences. As I've said, she maybe was in danger of on the previous track, you just hear it straight up on this one. But at the end of the day, re-listening to it, it's a pretty solid song overall. The chorus is nice and catchy. It's got a bit of an earworm to it. And I wouldn't cut it off the album. Initially, I did feel that way about it. I don't have a whole lot to say about it in terms of lyrical content or anything like that. It's just a solid tune.
It doesn't feel as special to me as a lot of the other songs, but still definitely at least a good song. Favourite moment here is probably the full-on synth explosion with the chorus. Once it just comes in, full-on new wave, 80s inspired. Yeah, also not got really much to say. Kind of takes the funky bass of the first half of Why We Ever and goes full length with it.
I was going to say, actually, like, with those similarities between this track and Why We Ever, it doesn't help the sequencing that much that we have two songs back-to-back that are quite similar, because that hasn't really happened on the album so far. So that's another point that I noted that I thought was a little bit of a disappointment.
I guess it didn't bother me just because the second half of Why We Ever, that's long enough that
I guess
I'm
you're
not
right.
thinking about the first half of Why We Ever once Pure Love comes on.
Yeah, with my hypothetical that if Why We Ever never developed from that first section, if that were the case, then I'd have a real issue with Pure Love following it up. So it's not as much of an issue as it could have been, but definitely the influence of Fleetwood Mac are really strong with these two tracks, and it's slightly derivative, honestly. But, you know, performances are still great, and they're still both pretty solid songs overall.
I must not be paying as much attention because I didn't catch any Fleetwood Mac from this album at all.
Really?
Yeah, I've not actually heard much Fleetwood Mac either, to be honest.
It's more in the chord progressions, honestly, and the synth sounds I've found. It's only on a few select tracks, don't get me wrong. It's not so much full songs, although the sort of laid-back vibe of a song like Dreams, I feel like these songs are really reminiscent of that, and maybe I'm just subconsciously making those connections because I know that Hayley is a big fan of that band. But I do honestly hear it.
Fair.
I do hear it.
Maybe you could say Tango in the Night era Fleetwood Mac a bit, but I wouldn't say as a whole Fleetwood Mac personally. But yeah, she's definitely at least influenced by them. I just don't hear it like Cam.
Coincidentally, I was just on Twitter earlier, and she said that she had like taken over some like Sirius radio station playthrough, like a Fleetwood Mac tribute, and she said, "I hope y'all are ready for some Tango in the Night."
That's pretty interesting. That's like her favorite, or could be, yeah.
Yeah. So like I don't really hear. I feel like I've said this before about a couple other songs on this album, but like I don't really hear Why We Ever and Pure Love as being very similar songs. Mostly because like Why We Ever just kind of feels a little more slower tempo, spaced out, kind of floaty. Pure Love is another, like, I mean, I probably bring this up too much, but it's kind of hard not to. Like, it's another one of the songs that really feels like it could have been on After Laughter.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with that, yeah.
Like I was saying with another one earlier, I latch onto this one a bit more than most stuff on After Laughter because it's more straightforward and it feels more optimistic, whereas most of the stuff on After Laughter was, you know, sarcasm couched in the, you know, sugary 80s sound and dealing with that, like, kind of distance, that much sarcasm to keep the emotion of the songs at arm's length it just makes that album kind of hard to listen to for me. And then, like, I feel the, you know, the relative straightforwardness of a song like Pure Love a lot more.
Yeah, Pure Love definitely feels more positive and constructive a song than a lot on After Laughter.
It feels healthier too. Like it feels.
Yeah.
I feel better enjoying it. You know.
I absolutely get what you mean.
I think the headspace that Hayley's in on this album overall, though she has a lot of conflicted and depressive thoughts and feelings, and she certainly has experience with mental illness and has opened up about that in interviews, but even if she hadn't done that, it would be very apparent from the lyrical content of this album and After Laughter and a great deal of Paramore's material before that. But yeah, I get what you mean. It doesn't feel quite as tongue-in-cheek in that way, I guess, of having these really groovy and danceable instrumentals paired with dark subject matter that's kind of masked in a way as like kind of a delivery mechanism, and I love that honestly, but I can see how you find it not challenging to listen to, but like hard to return to, Cam, just emotionally speaking. I don't think that that's the case on this album, really.
No, like
it feels like a continuation of that sound, but like in this different songwriting context, I guess. I'd say that about Over Yet as well, even though I said that song could realistically fit on After Laughter. In terms of the songwriting approach, it's different from anything on that album. And then next we have what is probably my least favourite track, the song Taken. This one to me just feels really underdeveloped. Outside of its laid-back bass line, it does very little to distinguish itself from a lot of the sounds that Hayley and company already explored beforehand, which, granted, is to be expected with a project this long that is trying to keep things varied but also cohesive. I just honestly think this one could have been cut. The chorus doesn't really do anything for me. It just sort of falters lyrically a little bit. It doesn't really do anything for me in that department either, and the chorus was just so repetitive as well. Having listened to this album a bunch of times already because I really like it, I reached the point where I felt like skipping this track much quicker than any other song, and I don't really feel like skipping any other song besides this one. It's not terrible, but it also just doesn't do much to distinguish itself outside of that loungy little bass line.
Just feels like a lighter song, but without much of a personal lyrical weight or a great pop hook to justify it. Just sounds alright to me. I mean, Ed pretty much said everything I was going to say. Like, it probably is one of the weakest songs on the album.
Yeah. What do you think, Cam?
I don't agree, but I can't argue.
That's an interesting turn of phrase.
It's the shortest song on the album. I mean, only 12 seconds shorter than Creepin, but we're gonna ignore that. But I don't know, I like the laid back lounginess of it, and I feel like it works between Pure Love and Sugar on the Rim.
Fair.
Moving on from there, we have a much more successful song in my mind, Sugar on the Rim. In terms of genre experiments on this album, this is probably simultaneously the most out there one for the context of the record, but also going into sounds that are already really well established, not exactly experimental. But yeah, she does a great job with this 80s dance influence. There's a little bit of New Order in here, I'd say, in the sound of the drum machines. I also really like how this song explores the notion of love as kind of a bittersweet concept in a really clever and direct way, using the phrase in the title. I don't know if Sugar on the Rim's like a common phrase where Hayley's from. I've never heard that phrase before. It's a very cool disco house tinged dance number that stands out stylistically in the track list. And I think you could make the case that it doesn't really fit in here musically, but personally I think the lyrical content makes sure that it does fit in. I'm just really glad she managed to keep things fresh this deep into the track list. I really enjoyed this one. It's danceable and just an interesting vibe for Hayley. You'd never hear this on a Paramore record at all.
Yeah, this is the most far removed song from a Paramore song, especially the 2000s material I can think of. Like, do you think the Scene Kids could have imagined this would exist back in the day?
Oh, the Scene Kids would have burned every copy of Riot and All We Know Is Falling as soon as they heard this.
That sounds like an overreaction, but honestly, I've seen some of those circles and the way they reacted to the self-titled and After Laughter.
Self-titled, even?
Almost acting as if Paramore had gone too poppy and become sellouts, even though the self-titled is clearly their most outwardly experimental album, even more so than After Laughter, which is a lot more cohesive and dedicated to that synth-pop new wave sound. So what do they know, honestly? Like, and I'm completely generalizing there.
Yeah.
Please don't take that on the chin, but like, yeah, they would have burned every copy of those early CDs for sure.
Yeah.
Because this is just completely outside of that wheelhouse.
Sugar on the Rim. What an interesting, unexpected song this is, to be honest.
Yeah.
The way she repeats Sugar on the Rim a lot, with the like weird robotic vocal effects, bass line, beats, the sort of energy of this song feels like a dance pop song to me more than anything else. Even though it's not a bonus track, it definitely has that feeling despite it being really good. Like, it feels like a sort of cool experiment song she might have worked on that she might have decided doesn't fit the album, but she still really likes it and wants to include it somewhere. At this point I was like, may as well add it. It's a pretty cool song. At certain points you could just play this in a club and I think you could get away with it, like especially in the second half. Although, is this a bit too weird to be played in clubs? Do clubs even exist anymore?
Only Club Quarantine. which is our subconscious clubbing mentality of listening to music like this and wishing we were in the club. This song definitely gives me that vibe. I don't know if you'd necessarily hear it in that setting, but maybe if it was a sleeper 80s hit that was actually released back then, it would have been right up there with the likes of Blue Monday. Not in terms of quality, but just as a staple dance hit.
Maybe.
But it is a really solid song.
You get people asking, what on earth does Sugar on the Rim mean to this day?
Yeah, it goes into that sort of bittersweet feeling. I think it's in reference to a glass of wine, so taking the bitter with the sweet, essentially. And yeah, the song explores love in that very unique context. I think, like I said, even though this is so different from the rest of the album musically, it doesn't feel out of place lyrically, I'd say. It still continues to explore other themes that have already been explored and developed over the course of the album so far.
Yeah, I don't think it's a phrase, like, 'cause I've never heard it used anywhere, but I don't drink, so I can't really relate to the concept anyway. I feel kind of bad because, again, it's not a bad song on its own, and, like, it does fit with the album thematically, at least this point of the album, but honestly, this would probably be my first pick of a song to cut.
Damn.
Like,
that's fair enough.
Just because it doesn't really gel with the rest of it. Like, if there was, like, a clearer flow from, like, the moodier stuff to more standard pop rock stuff to, full-on dancey, let's watch the world burn kind of stuff or whatever, I feel like it could fit better. And, like, I guess the next track, Watch Me While I Bloom, is, like, it still has a good groove and everything that carries on from Sugar on the Rim, but just, like, how extra Sugar on the Rim is, it just doesn't fit in my book.
That's completely fair. Yeah, it is definitely a lot further out there musically than any other sort of sound that's explored on the album. But it took me by surprise in a good way, I'd say.
Second last track. We're nearly there, guys. We're nearly there. Watch Me While I Bloom, again returning to sort of the flower analogies of growth, all that good stuff. I guess this has some of the strongest singing on the album. I don't know, it's sort of another dancey, funky number. It goes well after Sugar on the Rim. Pretty good song.
Yeah, this song, as Alex mentioned, continues the earthy, flowery metaphors that have been present throughout the album in a way that feels quite culminative to me. Like, it feels conclusive, like, here is the mission statement in terms of the album title, exactly what Hayley means by it. Of course, we mentioned before that Roses is another track that really goes into that, but this really puts a cap on it and serves to explain those metaphors and themes, even though I don't feel like it goes into it in as great depth as maybe I would have expected from a solo album. And that is kind of my main issue with this album overall. A lot of it feels like toe dipping in terms of the ideas and genres. It doesn't go incredibly deep into one particular idea, except on a song-to-song basis. But there's still themes present throughout, and it still feels like it's all being projected from Hayley's own experience. But yeah, in terms of Watch Me While I Bloom, besides that theme being carried in a good way, I think this one feels a tad underdeveloped. It's another track like Taken, where the chorus feels a bit too repetitive for its own good to me. Its smoking gun, though, on the vocal front is in Hayley's strained, punky approach to the vocals here, especially on the verses. It reminds me a lot more of slightly older Paramore material, and it was cool to hear, because I do like it when Hayley sort of strains her vocals in that way. And it's cool that the instrumental is so minimal underneath that, as opposed to it being an emo, rocky instrumental as we're used to hearing those types of vocals over.
I like the way she changes things up with the third chorus. Like, she changes the way she approaches the chorus. Like you say, she strains her vocals with some sort of backing vocals towards the third chorus specifically. That's what I'm saying. She like changes the way she sings it, which is a nice change up towards the end.
It definitely needed that, but I do feel like this track is a lot longer than it should have been. It feels more small scale. It's 3 minutes 44 in total, so it's not incredibly long, but it's good that it had that little change up in the last chorus, because honestly I was already getting kind of tired of it. Even though I'm pretty mixed on this one, it is solid enough. It feels like it's just less developed overall than a lot of the other material on here, and it's very noticeable, but conceptually I dig it.
And that brings us to the closing track, Crystal Clear. And this one reminded me, like, just from the water metaphor, it reminded me of Pool from After Laughter, and that's the last time I'm going to bring it up, I swear to Bob. But then this one also gave me another, like, outside reference point. Like, I don't know if it was an influence necessarily, but just thematically, it 100% serves the same purpose as one of my low-key favorite tracks of the last decade, Clean by Taylor Swift.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I'm like, that one doesn't quite have, well, I mean, it's got the, flooding or leaking the roof, flooding the room or whatever, but like, that one also has like the butterfly metaphor this one doesn't quite have. Then it also kind of ties into the water metaphor that was briefly used in the first verse of Dead Horse. The every morning I wake up from a dream of you holding me underwater.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Then you've got more of this, like, jumping in with the rush to my head only to find the water was concrete. And I'm pretty sure it's like a self-conscious reference to Pool.
I think it definitely is. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't actually even really think about it in that context, but now that you're saying it, it's all kind of coming together.
Yeah, and then it just flips it on its head because it's one of the ones, like, it doesn't feel as overtly sarcastic covered by 80s popness as a lot of the songs in After Laughter, but it does kind of have a darker meaning that you don't catch on the first listen, whereas this one is more about the optimism, like the baptismal quality of water, and that's also why it reminded me of Clean, because of like the way the choruses go, like the focus on a more echoey vocal performance or production style on Hayley and Taylor in the two songs. So this is probably the last contender for my top 5 on the album.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely, if we're talking about this in terms of the 3 sections or 3 parts of the album, this is easily my highlight for the third part, and I'm glad it's the closer. I'm glad Hayley managed to close it out in a good way. It ties together a lot of the themes of the album really well, and it also feels like just a good positive endpoint for the album, even though it does have those darker themes explored. It feels kind of like, not to sound too obvious, but like her mind has been cleared of these things in a way. She feels like she can actually move forward. So in that regard, it works really well as a closing track. But I also just really like the instrumental here. It has a bit more of an odd sort of sample-based feel to it, which, come to mention it, Hayley actually made a very sweet post on Instagram talking about the fact that her granddad is actually sampled on this song. That faint, sort of slightly distant vocal sample that you can hear if you listen real close. Apparently that's Hayley Williams' granddad, so it's kind of sweet in that regard.
Nice.
But yeah, I think this one is just a very catchy and conclusive, just lots of things beginning with C, which I guess is fitting for the title of the song. But yeah, it's a really good closer. I think between Sugar and the Rim and this, it really makes the last section of the album worthwhile, because the other tracks in this section are what sort of bring the whole thing down a little bit for me, honestly. She definitely closes it out in a really good way, with another track that feels like it is making another stylistic shift from what we've heard before, but it still feels like it's part of the same album, thanks to the themes and also the general aura of the atmosphere and the production.
All I could really add is I actually thought this was more like this is the song that felt the most like it could fit on After Laughter to me. Not lyrically, but I feel like the synth sound and guitar sound reminded me a lot of what that album had, and yes, even though a lot of this album will sound like that because it is a lot of the same people playing on it. Yeah, I just felt like this could fit musically on After Laughter somewhere.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna change something I said before, because I know I said Over Yet is definitely the strongest contender in that regard for like sounding like a real continuation of that sound. You're absolutely right. This is the most After Laughter-esque song on here. Yeah, I'm glad she could close it out with a quality song.
I do too.
So yeah, overall, this is a really solid album from Hayley. I think she can definitely come out with a more cohesive set of tracks next time around. I do have problems with how weirdly cohesive but also kind of uncongealed the general tone and themes of this album are, because it does all come together in some way, but it just feels like faintly cohesive, a lot less so than the other Paramore albums I've heard that I enjoy. But in terms of song quality, in terms of the performances, the difference between Hayley here and on those albums in terms of quality is pretty marginal. She went into it with more of a sense of adventure and like, right, what can I do in the context of this is a solo work now? What genres can I explore? Where can I dip my toes? And it does have that vibe of her just lightly experimenting with those things, which makes it feel a bit less like a personal narrative album and more like a series of genre experiments and celebrations of the sounds that Hayley's been influenced by. That being said, it does have really good themes going through the album, and she paints a great picture of her own perspective and her experiences with love and frustration and mental illness and various other things. So, on the whole, even though I'd say the sequencing is a bit scattershot and the variety of tracks works in some ways and not in others, and I definitely would have cut a few of them, this is a solid enough album overall that I would give it maybe a strong 6, verging on a 7. I think if it was cut down to just my favourite tracks, it'd almost certainly be at least a 7. Check this one out if you haven't already. If you're not even a fan of Paramore, I think you should check this out because it does foray into a lot of much celebrated music, you know? Like the Radiohead influence, as we've mentioned, is very apparent and well integrated into these songs, especially Simmer, which is, you know, one of the best songs of the year, easily. On the whole, I really enjoyed it. I just hope she can do something more, I guess, conceptually rich next time around.
So, like I said at the beginning, when this album was announced and when I first heard Simmer, I was hyped beyond belief, and the album definitely lived up to the hype, but not necessarily in the ways that I was hoping for or the ways that I anticipated from the first song, or even the first 2 or 3 songs. You can definitely point to flaws on it, like the sequencing isn't the best that it could have been, and some possible quibbles you can have with the concept, like maybe the flower metaphor could have been, developed and used more throughout the album. I was really fascinated by it when it was announced, like just, the concept of petals for armor, and then, reading into it and thinking, okay, so if she can, like, really find somewhere to go with this, it'll be incredible. And then seeing the way that it developed through the first 3 music videos, I'm like, okay, this could really gel into something. The styles of the songs are maybe a little too disjointed, and maybe the flow of, being stuck in a bad mental state to finally reaching a place of peace and acceptance could have been represented better with a slightly better flow and sequencing. But I don't think that there's anything actually bad about any of the songs. And the ones that are good are great and powerful enough to elevate the project as a whole. And after all that nonsense, I'm gonna slap a nice 8 out of 10 on this one.
Nice.
Okay, I'm gonna give this a cool 7 out of 10. I think it's a foregone conclusion that Paramore fans, especially ones of the, well, maybe only ones of the 2010 ones, the self-titled and After Laughter, and maybe just Paramore fans in general, will dig this. It's a logical continuation of that. She's bared her soul on a lot of these songs. Some of these songs are quite sad, some of these are really positive and healthy. That was a good word Cam put out there earlier. Some of these songs just feel like her in the songs, like she's putting across how she feels, and by the end of it, you feel like you've experienced something with her, and this is just an excellent set of songs for the most part. Some are weaker, you could definitely cut them, but you could always cut an album down to less songs and make it stronger, arguably. Like, you can always do that. Some songs here aren't that memorable, and some are some of the best songs I think she's ever been involved with. So, yeah, 7 out of 10. Really happy with this one. I think she can probably improve on it next time, and I'm very excited to see if she does that, or if it's just Paramore from here on out. Very interested to see what she does next.
Yeah, because Paramore haven't necessarily split up. She's just kind of taking a break from that right now, from what I understand. I'm also really excited to see where she goes from here. I think while this album could have been a hell of a lot better than it ended up being, just like Cam said, based on the first few singles, I kind of had an idea in my mind of how this would go, and I figured it would be a much more cohesive record. I didn't expect it to be so scattershot, but what we got was a solid record overall, and yeah, can't wait to see what she does next. I think Hayley Williams deserves all the love she's getting because she's a great personality in the world of music and great performer, and she has very good taste, I would say, in terms of what influences she takes on board.
Yeah, along with like the Radiohead and Fleetwood Mac that we kept mentioning, you can point to all kinds of other artists for the influence on this. You can say there's Bjork influence, there's some of The Knife, there's all kinds of amazing stuff that people could discover through this album.
Yeah. I just hope for her next release she just surprise drops it rather than giving us 2/3 of it before the album's out.
Yeah, I mean, she can do it however she wants. I just, personally, I'm not a big fan of that rollout style. It feels like it's kind of contributing to the sort of playlistification of music and the playing a bit too much into ease of access and not really allowing people to see a complete cohesive work. I think when Kevin Abstract did it, I was not enjoying the music he was dropping from his last album all that much until the full album came out. And thankfully that's not what happened here, but maybe it would be what happened if I did end up listening to the 2 EPs beforehand. It's more just the amount of time it took for this album to come out that I think really kind of mellowed out the hype a little bit. But as with everything, I went into this with no expectations and came out enjoying it. So yeah, thanks for joining us on this very lengthy episode of Busted Speakers. I hope this one wasn't too arduous to get through for you guys. But yeah, thanks for listening, guys, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye.